Now, there are fears that a polarizing election will further inflame the culture war in the U.S. This week, the Department of Homeland Security warned of a rise in right-wing terrorism. The potential targets, including the LGBTQ community, as well as racial and ethnic minorities. Now, while the debate over gun controls remains deadlocked in Washington, one organization says the best protection for vulnerable groups is to give them guns as well. DW's Amian Isif caught up with them.
Rob Royce knows his guns inside and out.
This is for the revolver. That's 9mm, pretty standard 45 ACP for the fellow right there.
He's a certified handgun instructor, but not what you might call a typical one. He isn't a police officer, he's not in the military, and he doesn't vote Republican. He's a member of the Socialist Rifle Association, and he knows his politics may be a bit out of place here at this rural shooting range in Maryland. When he talks about the training he offers, he lowers his voice.
So for what we're doing, the target group is to provide a safe space for trans, queer, people of color, and other marginalized groups to get this training.
No teaching today, just target practice with fellow SRA member Eric to keep informed. In the parking lot, a prejudice is confirmed. A bumper sticker with an anti-trans slur.
Rob and I want to make sure that, that there is pushback against this kind of shit. That, trans people have a right to live.
The Socialist Rifle Association was formed in 2017 and now claims several thousand members. A handful of the Maryland's chapter's members have come out to this monthly picnic. They say they're nothing like a right-wing militia, but one thing they do have in common is the belief that guns will make them safer.
So I bought my first gun. It was a shotgun 10 days after January 6th. I was terrified that, there's going to be an armed militia at the grocery store, and my child is non-binary. They hear me say they, them, or whatever, and so they just total this essence of paranoia.
So I was raised Jewish, and I sort of recently came out as trans, and both of those aspects to my identity put me at a higher risk for political violence. When you hear about it so much, it feels like sooner or later it'll get to you. And you don't want to be in a position where you don't see it coming.
Perhaps surprisingly, there aren't any weapons at the picnic, but there are tourniquets and wound packing. After the barbecue, Rob teaches a first aid course called Stop the Bleed.
Stop right there. Look for blood on your hands.
There are no illusions here that carrying a firearm makes you completely invincible. In the U.S., an overwhelming majority of those who lean left politically support stricter gun laws and are less than half as likely to own firearms as those who lean right. But at this public outreach event in a park in Washington, D.C., the Socialist Rifle Association finds an audience for its message that there's an arms race in this country whether you like it or not, and the right wing is winning by a long shot.
A report by my colleague Amian Isif, who joins me in the studio. If I'm honest, this was quite disheartening. Can you tell us a little more about the socio-political climate that makes people in vulnerable communities resort to guns for their own protection, because obviously they don't feel protected by the authorities?
Certainly, yeah. I sense a sense of hopelessness there. The Department of Homeland Security just came out with a report yesterday, actually, outlining that the new terrorist threat in the U.S. right now is from extremist violence, specifically right-wing violence. Here's what they said in this bulletin. The likely targets of potential violence in the U.S., including critical infrastructure, are members of the LGBTQIA community, schools, racial and ethnic minorities, and government facilities and personnel, including law enforcement. And also the threat against law enforcement is now coming from the right wing, not just the left wing like we saw with the Black Panthers and things like this in the 60s and 70s. So there's definitely a climate here that's different from when I was a kid. Growing up, left wing and gun ownership just did not go together. But I think, since the 2020 elections, this kind of polarization in the United States, then culminating in the January 6th riots at the Capitol building, the storming of the Capitol, that was a watershed moment for a lot of people on the political left when they saw this eruption of of violence from the right wing. And I think that stuck with a lot of people. You saw one of these guys in my report saying that he literally went out a few days afterwards and bought a shotgun because his kid identifies as non-binary, and he was worried about protecting his own family. So this idea of protecting your own family on the left wing.
It's an argument, though, that the gun lobby has used for a really long time, right? It takes a good guy with a gun to take down a bad guy with a gun. How surprised were you to see that on the left of the political spectrum?
Right. This is kind of new to this generation now. You haven't seen this since previous eras in U.S. history. Now, this is not surprising to a historian who's looked at the U.S. Gun violence has existed at both the left and the right. You had union members, radical socialist union members in the 30s carrying weapons to defend themselves. You had the Black Panther movement in the 60s and 70s arming themselves against police. That was very provocative at that time. But this is pretty new, this idea that the left people, LGBT members, it's very new that they were take up arms to defend themselves. So yeah, I think that I haven't heard this argument coming from the left wing in my lifetime, but one difference that I would highlight is not this sense of like a hero who's at a shopping mall and saves everybody from an attack. That didn't exist in this group that I talked to. It was more the idea of that if I'm trans and I am specifically, personally, a target for right-wing hate crimes, then it's more about protecting myself against these crimes.
It's heartbreaking, really. And the truth is quite the opposite, isn't it? More guns don't mean more safety.
That's right. Statistically, it's insignificant. You know, you have these horrible attacks from the right wing in the U.S., this horrible bloodshed and violence, but that doesn't make individuals statistically more likely to die from gun violence, politically motivated gun violence. It's still just a small percentage of gun-related deaths. But what is interesting is, you know, that this idea exists that they have to do that. So yeah, I think going back to the idea that owning a gun will make you safer. This study after study shows that this is simply not true. There was one from Philadelphia that said possessing a firearm, it was done over a year, possessing a firearm makes you 4 times more likely in an assault to die from that assault. And if you had a chance to defend yourself, meaning if you could actually draw your gun and defend yourself, then you were 5.5 times more likely to die. So even the idea of like being aware of somebody attacking you with a gun, having a gun yourself, you are more and more likely, the more armed you are, essentially, to die in an attack.
I mean, Isif, thank you so much.